My name is Dennis Samut. I'm the director of Links Europe, a peace-building organization based in The Hague, in the Netherlands. For the last 30 years, I have traveled across the post-Soviet space and was close to many of the events and developments that impacted this vast region. In this series of video diaries, I will revisit some of the key issues that have dominated the region, and I will share some of my personal recollections and experiences. As recent developments in Ukraine have shown, much of what has happened in the past 30 years still has consequences in the present reality for people living in Europe and beyond. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved on the 26th of December 1991. The Soviet flag came down from the ramparts of the Kremlin and up went the tricolor of the Russian Federation. There was a lot of political turmoil, there was a lot of economic confusion, and this was the ongoing theme throughout the Yeltsin years, because in fact, Yeltsin tried but never really got a grip on how to make the transformation from a totalitarian communist state into something that resembled a democratic state with a liberal economy. However, I would say that of all the difficulties that Yeltsin had, the one difficulty that really haunted him throughout the period that he was president of Russia, the one thing that really disenchanted the people of Russia from the leadership in the Kremlin was Chechnya. So after, and even before, immediately before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there were very strong nationalist tendencies that started erupting right across the Soviet space, but these were mainly in the republics around Russia. So the Soviet Union was made up of 15 constituent republics. Many of these republics were based on ethnicities or linguistic affiliations. And in many of these republics, nationalist tendencies emerged very quickly, even during the time of Gorbachev, and Gorbachev struggled to try to keep things within some kind of bounds. When Yeltsin took over, on the one hand, he did not have this problem, because all the other 14 republics had left and were now independent states, but he was left with Russia. And in Russia itself, there were some tensions, but none were very serious. Some were serious, but were very political, like in Tatarstan. But in Chechnya, the nationalist tendencies were serious, they were violent, and they were also undermining the very basis on which the Yeltsin administration was formed. So Yeltsin had to deal with Chechnya throughout the time that he was in office. He did that by launching a war in 1994, and in fact, his final moments were the moments when actually the Second Chechen War started. So Chechnya was always at the forefront and always in the background as well of events as they were happening in Russia in the 1990s. Obviously, the brunt of force used against Chechnya by Russian troops on two occasions, in 1994, 96, and then in 1999 and 2000, was also very important. But I would say that the absence of a proper form of statehood was one of the reasons why the Chechen dream of independence failed. For a long time, the Chechen situation was a serious political challenge to Yeltsin, but it was never really a serious military challenge. And the advice that he was given, and also the advice that he was given by Western leaders who were also following the situation rather closely, was that he should try to find a political solution. And I think with hindsight, we can say that if Yeltsin had been more patient, the situation in Chechnya would have evolved sooner rather than later, and military force would not have been necessary. But that was not the case because Yeltsin was under intensive domestic pressure, because his failure to rein in the Chechen rebels was seen as a sign of his weakness as a president. And that unleashed the first Chechen War in 1994, which was very messy and which saw Russia essentially destroying one of its own cities, Grozny. When I traveled to Grozny first time, it was already several years after the first Chechen War, and I was shocked. I had never seen a big city destroyed in the way that Grozny was. And this reminded me of pictures that I had seen of the Second World War, and it was exactly like that. And this also reminds me of what we're seeing today in Ukraine, where also this approach of having disregard for civilian populations and attacking big urban areas with massive military force can have very serious and grave consequences. So Yeltsin launched his war and lost it, essentially, because the Chechens, despite the fact that they were disorganized, despite the fact that they were divided, despite the fact that there was no real Chechen state, there was a Chechen nation and there was a Chechen society that once attacked from outside, rallied together and put up a very stiff and spirited resistance to the Russian invasion. And so the Russian army, not being very happy, fighting on its own land rather than fighting NATO or some other outside enemy that it had imagined it was going to be doing in the past, essentially had to agree that it could not suppress the Chechens, and so some kind of arrangement then came into play, which meant that the fighting stopped in 1996, and then we had this interregnum period between 96 and 99 when people hoped that things could work out differently, where a political framework could be found for Chechnya to remain part of Russia, but with a very big level of autonomy.
Свободная, суверенная Чечня, Чеченская республика, Ичкерия.
Нам не надо российским ничего. Мы просим свой независимость, свой земля, свободной ходили.
Islam is a very important feature in Chechen identity. In Chechnya, for many centuries, people identified with Sufism and practiced Islam through the Sufi tradition. This was and remains, even until today, widespread, and this has contributed a lot to keeping Chechen identity. The Sufi tradition has been one of the key factors that kept it together. It's also one of the factors that gives it a particular identity, even when compared with other elements within the North Caucasus. One of the important, interesting, and essential things to remember when discussing the issue of Islam in Chechnya is the fact that one of the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of this new situation of chaos, let's put it this way, was that other traditions of Islam started being introduced in Chechnya. You had people from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and some other places who practiced the Wahhabi tradition of Islam, who traveled to Chechnya and found there a good ground for taking forward their ideas. And this started creating a division within Chechen society that had very serious consequences later. The Wahhabists came with money, and they also came with ideas that was close to the Chechen tradition, were in a sense more ascetic, and so they kind of fitted better the current situation in the difficult moments of war and in the immediate period after war. This created tensions between those who started professing these Wahhabi traditions and the traditional followers of Sufi Islam. And this reflected itself in all kinds of different ways in the period until the Second Chechen War. One also needs to focus on the role of criminality. Criminality played a major role in the story of Chechnya and has to be factored in if one wants to understand what happened and why. Chechens had, because they were a nation under attack to a certain extent for a long time, had developed their own networks in Moscow and across the former Soviet Union. And they became very powerful. And as the state started weakening, as the Soviet Union collapsed and the new Russia emerged, Chechen mafias became extremely important in Moscow as providing protection rackets and controlling big chunks of business. This meant that also that Chechens had supply of money and revenue that was not available to others in this period. And one can say that Chechnya was, especially in the early years, supported by these criminal groups. So one should not romanticize the issue of Chechnya to the point where one forgets that this was also part of the story. Secondly, on the ground in Grozny itself, when Dudayev, the first president of Chechnya, took over and started trying to organize an army, he realized that he had not much choice, and he brought in a lot of criminal elements, including a lot of people who had just been released from jails, as part of his army. And this, on the one hand, it gave him manpower, which he needed, but on the other hand, it created a distorted picture, which had other consequences later on. I traveled to Grozny for the first time. I think it was the end of 1997. The Second War had finished, but the situation was far from being normal or far from being calm. There was already a big risk of kidnapping. Why? Because these criminal groups that had been somehow brought in as part of the Chechen effort during the First War and just before, after the war finished, they went back to their old business of being criminals. And one way of making money was by kidnapping foreigners. There were not so many, but there were a few international organizations like the Red Cross, the OSCE, that had a presence in Chechnya. And these organizations were targeted. I remember when I first went to Chechnya for the first time, it was at the invitation of one of a small, very interesting Chechen NGO called Lamanas. And these people were really worried about my safety when I was there. And during the time I was there, several of them were carrying guns. And I said, why do we need this? And they said, no, this is absolutely necessary because, the risk is there. And I realized how much the risk was there later on another visit when I was in the compound of the president of Chechnya. At the time it was Mashadov. And one of Mashadov's aides told me, don't speak in English now. I said, why? He said, well, it's better if people don't understand that you're a foreigner because of this kidnapping risk. I said, we're in the presidential compound. He said, it doesn't matter. So this gives you an idea of how difficult the situation was. There were a number of organizations in Moscow at the time who clearly saw the Second Chechen War coming and were trying desperately to avoid it. We had very strong interaction with these organizations. One of them was called ADEPT. It was an organization led by English people, but there were others. And essentially, we worked over this period to try to explore what political solutions could be found for Chechnya, which essentially would have meant Chechnya being an autonomous part of the Russian Federation, but with a strong level of autonomy. And this went to the point where we worked with Russian experts to develop a kind of a model treaty or a model agreement on how this could be done. In 1999, months before the Second Chechen War started, we had a big event in Moscow, organized by my organization, by ADEPT, this English organization, and by the Gorbachev Foundation. It was held in the Hall of Nations in Moscow, a very prestigious place where Soviet leaders are laid to rest when they die. The great and the good of Russia came to this conference to speak about the necessity to avoid war. And among them was Gorbachev himself, who was one of the co-organizers. It was a very strong message, but I would say it was late, because I think that by this time it was already agreed within the Russian political and military establishment that they will go to war and finish the Chechen story once and for all. And I was in Chechnya when the Second War started. So the Second War started on the 7th of August of 1999. And I was there with this agreement, trying to see how much we can take it forward. And then our Chechen colleagues told us, look, you have to leave. It's no longer safe. And I was literally going out, and the Russian tanks were coming in. And it was a very dramatic journey. We got arrested in Ingushetia and then in North Ossetia. It took a long time to get to Georgia. But that was, in a sense, the moment when we realized that we had failed, that there was not going to be a peaceful solution to the Chechen problem, but there was going to be war. There was one incident that was particularly painful and not quite within our usual remit as an organization pushing a peace agenda and engaged in dialogue and confidence building. In December 1998, I was in Tbilisi and I got a phone call from somebody in Grozny. They said, the leadership here wants you to come. They need to speak to you urgently. You need to come immediately. So it was Christmas Day. I traveled to Grozny overnight, and then I was told, look, we have a situation. Four British people who had been kidnapped some time ago and who were known to have been killed already. Well, we eventually found their bodies. And so we want to repatriate their bodies to their country, because that's the proper thing to do. But we don't want to take them to Moscow, because if we take them to Moscow, the Russians will make a big scandal out of this. So can you help us to take these bodies to the UK, but not by going to Moscow? So this, I have to say, in the many experiences that I've had in my life before and after that, I don't think I had a similar one to this, but it was obviously a very serious issue, a very emotional issue for the family and relatives of these people. This was important that this should happen. So to cut a very long story short, we managed to establish the necessary communications with the people in London, with other relevant bodies, including Azerbaijan, because the plan was to take these bodies from Grozny to Baku and fly them from Baku to London rather than from Moscow. And essentially within 48 hours, we got the job done with a lot of cooperation from a lot of people. But I was struck at this point by how the Chechens, even in this chaos, even in this very difficult situation, they understood what needed to be done. They understood that they had to do this, that they had to repatriate these bodies. They had to show that whoever killed them was not the true reflection of the Chechen people, that the Chechen people had different views and had different feelings. When I went to Grozny in August 1999 with this draft that, as I said, had been worked out by Russian experts, not by British or American or European experts, but by Russian experts. In Grozny itself, I was told, okay, we can negotiate on the basis of this. But it was very, very clear that we were late, that the decision had already been taken. This was the moment when Vladimir Putin came on the scene, first as prime minister and soon to be president of Russia. And Putin had no intention whatsoever to negotiate with the Chechens. Putin wanted a clean resolution of the Chechen problem because he understood that Chechnya had essentially destroyed the Yeltsin presidency. I would put it as simply as that. Chechnya destroyed the Yeltsin presidency and made Yeltsin's job nearly impossible. So Putin understood he had no choice. He had to do this. And he did it. And he did it in the ruthless way that we have seen Putin dealing with these issues in other places since.
Российских войск, которых уничтожает террористов, бандитов, вот этих вот. Вот чем занимается Путин и его свора.
At the time, we have also to remember that the response of the international community towards the Second Chechen War was rather tepid because the foreign ministries of the Western countries were not interested in challenging Putin. They were interested in building bridges with Vladimir Putin. The Second Chechen War could have been avoided, but it could only have been avoided if the people in Moscow, some of who we were working with, and who understood the risk of this war, not only for the Caucasus region, but for the whole of the future of Russia, of the future of the project of a democratic Russia, if they had been more forceful and more active and more demanding in their positions politically in Moscow itself, particularly. So there was, of course, a lot of things that the Chechens themselves could have done. Certainly the weakness of the administration in Grozny, the failure of Makhadov to be able to control things even within his own compound, let alone within the rest of the republic, made things rather difficult. But on the other hand, a better approach from Moscow, one that would have taken a slightly longer term view of how to solve this problem, would have ensured that in the end a political solution could emerge. But Yeltsin could not afford peace, and Putin could afford it much less. So we ended up with two wars, both of which had massive humanitarian consequences, and particularly the second one has had consequences on how the new Russia emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And once it was felt that a military solution could do the job in Chechnya, then why couldn't it do the job in other places, like Georgia and like Ukraine? So the fact that the Second Chechen War was allowed to happen, the fact that the reaction from the West was so weak at the time, had consequences, some of which we are still experiencing and passing through at the moment. The Chechens fought heroically, like always, but they were also fragmented, much more than they were in the First War. This division between the Wahhabists, who had created their own centers of power in the south of Chechnya and elsewhere, and the rest of Chechen society, this fragmentation played out during the Second War, and so a Russian victory was possible. And after the Russian victory came the Russian peace, and the Russian peace was also very costly. First, Russia introduced a very strict sort of military regime on Chechnya. A lot of the Chechen fighters went underground, essentially in the forests, and continued fighting for about 10 years. They were mainly groups related to Wahhabist groups, jihadist groups, that later reinvented themselves and started appearing in all parts of the world as part of the Al-Qaeda or part of terrorist groups, were inspired by a very distorted view of Islam. After the initial kind of military response, the Kremlin wanted to have a solution that would be a little bit more long-lasting and a little bit more enduring and sustainable. And so they essentially used the Kadyrovs to do that. More precisely, Ramazan Kadyrov, who took over when his father was killed in 2004. So Ramazan Kadyrov has approached this with a ruthless model. His approach was to completely destroy any resistance and then from that situation build something new. And he managed to persuade Putin that he could deliver, and he also managed to persuade Putin to provide the money for some kind of reconstruction of Grozny and other parts of Chechnya, and in return, he became the most loyal servant. But it's very important to understand Kadyrov is the most loyal servant of Putin. He's not the most loyal servant of Russia. So, in a sense, Kadyrov also, in his own convoluted way, personifies the Chechen desire for its own identity. Kadyrov may today be the most loyal of Russia's subjects, but this is only because he is the most loyal of Putin's subjects. If the situation in Russia had to change, if Putin will not be the leader of Russia, then Kadyrov's loyalty will not be to Moscow, it will be to something else. Kadyrov has been playing a very prominent role in Ukraine as a vocal champion of Putin's war in Ukraine. It's a very odd situation because, on the one hand, Chechen fighters are in Ukraine on the Russian side, but there are also Chechen fighters in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side. And so some of the problems of Chechnya are actually playing out in Ukraine at the moment. One of the reasons why the Kremlin tolerates Kadyrov and actually even boosts his image every now and then is that, very ironically, but the truth is that Kadyrov has become something of a symbol for some Russian youth as the sort of tough guy who is not afraid of anyone and is on the other hand, the biggest loyal supporter of Mother Russia. And so Kadyrov has a role also in domestic Russian politics rather than just simply a nuisance value in Ukraine. Of course, the extent to which Chechen fighters are in Ukraine is not big enough to make any material difference to the war. Chechens are courageous fighters, so whoever side they're fighting for, they will fight well, but the numbers are not huge. So their presence is more symbolic, I would say, than it is real, but it is another example of how this Chechen identity, but confused relationship with the state continues to play out in all kinds of different ways. Vladimir Putin has used Chechnya as an example of how tough action can solve problems that seem to be unsolvable. And it sent a clear message to everyone in Russia and amongst Russian neighbors that Putin's government was a different government from Yeltsin's government. And although Yeltsin had launched wars on Chechnya in 1994, and officially he was still president when the second war started in 1999, everyone understood that his heart was not really in it. But in terms of Putin, everyone understood that Putin was committed to this approach and to this way of solving problems. And I think this sent a very important message. For a lot of Russians, it was a welcome message. And we have to accept that one of the things that made Putin popular in Russia was his tough handling of Chechnya in the beginning. Today, Chechnya has become somewhat secondary to other things, because a lot of other things have been happening. But the Chechen factor, the Chechen model, if you want, of dealing with problems remains there. And it has been an important element in defining Vladimir Putin and defining what he stands for and in defining how he operates. The world is now facing another war in which Russia is involved, in which Moscow is involved. There are elements of this war in Ukraine that are very similar to the wars played out in Chechnya in the 1990s, including the massive use of force against civilian urban centers. This would not be acceptable for many countries, but the Russians created a precedent by doing it within their own territory in Chechnya in the 1990s. And we saw them also repeating the same process, perhaps not to the same extent in Georgia in 2008, although some of the bombardments of Gori were on a similar scale. But certainly in Ukraine, we have seen a repetition of what happened in Grozny, and very much a model that the Russian army had sort of developed of urban warfare that is scary in many ways, that is not acceptable for democratic societies, but in states that have very tight control over the mass media, their political activity, they can get away with it. And this is, in a sense, one of the biggest lessons from this, that until the political leadership in Moscow feels it is not really accountable to public opinion and to a democratic process, it can also feel it can get away with these adventures, whether they are within its own territory or, as we have seen in Georgia and in Ukraine, whether it is in the sort of so-called near abroad or in the future also elsewhere. So the dangers that were highlighted in Chechnya in the 1990s are now playing out on a much bigger scale across Europe and beyond.